listening to Dreams of Time.
Close your eyes. Let the noise of the modern world slip quietly away. Imagine a land shrouded in mist, damp forests, muddy roads, smoke curling from wooden huts, the distant sound of bells carried by the wind. No electricity, no running water, only cold stone and fire. This is France, over 1.400 years ago. The 6th century, a time often remembered, unfairly, as the Dark Ages. But in darkness, the stars shine brightest, and in this forgotten world, amidst plagues, crumbling empires, and endless war, lived two women, two rivals, who would shape the fate of a kingdom. They were not princesses waiting to be rescued. They were queens who would rescue themselves and destroy others, if they had to. One, born into gold and scripture, educated among scholars and poets. The other, a slave, unknown, unmentioned, until her fire was impossible to ignore. This is the story of Brunhild and Fredegund. They were separated by blood, by origin, by belief, and yet bound together by fate. Their rivalry would span decades, marked by betrayal, assassination, and civil war. Queens in a brutal world ruled by swords and suspicion. They lived in the shadow of Rome, but there was nothing Roman about their world anymore. In these lands once governed by emperors and law, chaos reigned, kings rose and fell, cities burned, and power? It belonged to those who could take it and hold it. The Franks, a Germanic people who now ruled much of what we call France, had split their lands among 4 royal brothers, each with ambitions, each with enemies, and each with wives and lovers who would shape the course of their reigns. Brunhild came from the south, from the Visigothic kingdom of Spain, a land still holding onto fragments of Roman civilization, paved roads, Latin verse, classical education. She was noble, intelligent, a princess used to structure and law. Fredegund came from the north, a slave, a servant in the court of a king, with no lineage, no land, and no one to protect her. Only her wit, her cunning, and an iron will that would carry her farther than anyone expected. They did not meet in battle. They met through marriage, through a tragic web of alliances and betrayals. They married brothers. They became sisters-in-law, rivals, enemies, opposites. Brunhild, the queen who tried to rule with justice and reason, who built roads, sponsored churches, and tried to bring Roman order to a Frankish world. Fredegund, the queen who ruled from the shadows, whose hands were never clean, whose knives were never far. She wielded fear as skillfully as a sword. One would die a queen, the other would die a prisoner, but both would leave behind a legacy written in blood. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a bedtime story. But it is a true story of queens who fought for power in a world that did not forgive powerful women. So take a breath, lean back, and let yourself drift into the mists of Merovingian Gaul, into the hearts and minds of 2 extraordinary women, Brunhild and Fredegund, and the world they fought to command. The year is 567. In the glittering halls of Toledo, the capital of the Visigothic kingdom of Spain, a young princess prepares to leave the only world she's ever known. Her name is Brunhild, daughter of King Athanagild, sister to Queen Galswintha. She's not yet 20, but her education has far outpaced her years. She speaks refined Latin, quotes Roman poets, and has been taught by Christian bishops, philosophers, and statesmen. She knows of cities, of structure, of dignity and law. She also knows she is being sent far away, into the unknown. To the north, beyond the Pyrenees, lies Austrasia, one of the 4 Frankish kingdoms carved from the Merovingian realm. There, King Sigebert I has asked for Brunhild's hand in marriage. It is a political alliance. Yes, but also a rare thing in this age. A royal man requesting a noble woman for her intellect, her faith, and her lineage. Brunhild agrees, with poise, but perhaps a quiet fear behind her steady gaze. She knows the journey will be long, that the world she's entering is rough, warlike, and deeply different from her own. Still, she rides north, over mountains and rivers, through forests that never end, until at last she sees it, Metz, her new home. An old Roman city repurposed into a Frankish stronghold. Stone mixed with timber, Latin mixed with Germanic dialects. Priests walking beside warriors, the past, jostling with the present, and standing on the ramparts. Awaiting her, is Sigebert. They meet not as strangers, but as equals. Their wedding is grand, by Frankish standards at least. Fortunatus, the wandering poet, writes a hymn for the occasion, praising Brunhild's grace and beauty. Church bells ring, crowds cheer. This union, for a moment, feels like hope, but far to the west. In the court of King Chilperic, Sigebert's half-brother, something darker stirs. Chilperic is jealous of his brother's kingdom. Yes, but also of his bride. He, too, wants a Visigothic princess, a match of elegance, of legitimacy, so he sends envoys south, to Toledo, asking for Brunhild's elder sister, Galswintha. Athanagild hesitates. Chilperic is not like Sigebert. Where Sigebert is steady, Chilperic is impulsive, known for his many concubines, his violent outbursts, and his ambition. But Galswintha is sent anyway. When she arrives in Rouen, her dowry is immense. 5 major cities in the south of Chilperic's kingdom. She brings jewels, silks, and a quiet sadness. Galswintha is older than Brunhild, more reserved, less romantic. She sees through the court's pomp. She sees Fredegund. Fredegund, once a servant in Chilperic's court, now his lover, and soon to be his queen. The story of Fredegund is shrouded in shadow. She was a slave, we are told, but from where? No one knows. She came from obscurity, yet rose through cunning. She served the queen, seduced the king, and now, as Galswintha steps into her palace, Fredegund steps aside, but only for now. It's not long before Galswintha catches Chilperic in bed with Fredegund. Her dignity wounded, her oath betrayed, Galswintha begs to return to Spain. But she never gets the chance. One morning, she is found dead, strangled in her bed. No thieves, no witnesses. And 3 days later, Chilperic marries Fredegund, in the very clothes Galswintha had worn. The Frankish world is stunned. Gregory of Tours, the chronicler of these events, writes with barely concealed fury. Everyone suspects Chilperic, no one doubts Fredegund's involvement. And in Metz, Brunhild weeps, not just for her sister, but for the betrayal, the insult, the challenge. Brunhild is no longer a bride. She is a widowed sister, a wronged queen, and in her, something shifts. Where once she might have smiled and played the role of foreign ornament, she now sharpens her mind. Her eyes narrow, her allies gather. She will not forgive, she will not forget. Meanwhile, Fredegund is crowned Queen of Neustria. She walks through the palace with the confidence of someone who has taken what she wanted and dares the world to challenge her. She's pregnant soon after, with a daughter, then a son. Her position, though still fragile, is reinforced with each child. But she knows Brunhild is watching. And Brunhild has something Fredegund lacks: legitimacy. This is the world they live in. A place where queens must not only birth kings, but also protect them. Where loyalty is as fleeting as spring frost. Where alliances are bought with coin, blood, or both. Years pass. Brunhild gives birth to a son, Childebert, on Easter morning. A good omen, they say. Sigebert celebrates. The court rejoices. The future feels secure. But Fredegund has other plans. She begins whispering into Chilperic's ear that Sigebert is growing too strong, that the people speak of him as the better king, that his queen is dangerous. Chilperic listens, and soon, war begins. Sigebert and Chilperic go to battle over land, over pride, and over the murder of Galswintha. Armies clash, cities fall, blood spills, but Brunhild does not waver. She holds Metz, she distributes gifts to bishops, she builds alliances, and then, in one of the most shocking moments of the era, Sigebert is assassinated. Two men, bearing poisoned daggers, stab him during a victory celebration. They are slaves, they say nothing, and they are executed before they can speak. But everyone knows who sent them. Fredegund. And now, Brunhild is alone, her husband dead, her son just a child, her throne endangered. Chilperic advances on Paris. Brunhild is taken, her son smuggled out in a basket, her daughters hidden across the border, her treasure seized. She is sent to a convent, a political exile in nuns' robes. But this is not the end. Brunhild will not fade into silence. She will rebuild, she will plot, she will return, and so will Fredegund, because this story is not a single battle. It is a war, waged over decades, between queens, between brothers, between old Roman order and new Frankish chaos. And it has only just begun. When a king dies, his queen is supposed to grieve. But when Sigebert I was murdered, stabbed in broad daylight by assassins holding poisoned daggers, Brunhild did not have the luxury of mourning. She was now the mother of a boy king, Childebert II. Not yet 6 years old, and in the Frankish world, a boy king was as much a liability as he was a legacy. Chilperic wasted no time. With Fredegund at his side, he marched into Paris. Brunhild, recently widowed, stood alone. Her treasury was taken, her children scattered. She was sent to a convent in Rouen, a gilded prison dressed as penance. But what the Merovingians should have known by now was this. Brunhild was never just a wife. She was never just a widow. And she would never be just a nun. The convent conspiracy. In Rouen, she found an unlikely ally, Adovera, Chilperic's discarded first wife. Adovera had once worn the queen's crown. Fredegund had stolen it from her. Now, in the gardens of the convent, the two wronged women plotted. They shared tea, prayers, and a vision. Adovera's son, Merivech, was a prince, ambitious and disillusioned with his father's reign. Brunhild? Still young, still queenly, and still dangerous. A union between them would do more than offer her protection. It would link Austrasia and Neustria under a single royal couple. A rebellion born of love, or at least necessity. Secret letters passed from cloister to camp. Soldiers loyal to Merivech rode through the forests. Ignoring their king's orders, priests whispered in cathedrals. And in the spring of 576, Merivech arrived in Rouen. He did not come as a conqueror, but as a bridegroom. The marriage took place in secret. The Bishop of Rouen, Pretextatus, himself a bold political actor, officiated the ceremony in defiance of the church, which forbade a man from marrying his aunt by marriage. It was dangerous, illegal, but it was brilliant. Merivech and Brunhild were now a threat. Together, they could claim the throne of Neustria. And perhaps more. But Fredegund saw what was happening. And she struck first. A king's wrath. When Chilperic discovered the marriage, he was furious. He arrived in Rouen at the head of an army. The city prepared for siege. Brunhild and Merivech held the high ground. Literally, taking refuge in a chapel on the walls dedicated to Saint Martin, the patron of the Franks. There, behind ancient stones, they waited. Eventually, Chilperic proposed a truce. He shared a meal with his son and his new bride, smiling, feigning acceptance. But even as they ate, Duke Wolf, a loyal supporter of Brunhild, launched an attack on Chilperic's capital of Soissons. The plot was clear. Chilperic acted swiftly. He stripped Marevech of his title, forced him to become a monk, a symbolic removal from royal succession. His head was shaved, his sword taken. The marriage was declared void by a new law invented for the occasion, forbidding marriage to one's uncle's wife. Brunhild was offered a choice: return to Austrasia with her children, alone and shamed, or remain in Neustria, stripped of power and position. She chose her children, with a mother's fire in her heart and political cunning in her mind. She returned to Metz, and this time, she was not just a foreign queen in a strange land. She was the regent of Austrasia, ruling for her young son, the traitor duke. Meanwhile, Marevech, once groomed for greatness, was now in exile, but not for long. A message came from Duke Boso, Brunhild's old ally: flee to Tours. Seek sanctuary in the Basilica of Saint Martin. You will be safe. Marevech did, and once again, the sacred space of the church became a battleground. But Fredegund, ever the spider in the shadows, sent Boso another message: betray the boy, lure him out, and you will be rewarded. Boso, greedy and restless, agreed. He invited Marevech on a hunting trip, an innocent pretext. But the plan failed. Marevech survived, and now, Fredegund knew something even more valuable than his blood. Boso could be bought. Still, time was against them. In 577, tragedy struck King Guntram, the elder brother of Sigibert and Chilperic. Both of his sons died from dysentery. With no heirs of his own, Guntram turned to Childebert II, Brunhild's young son, and offered adoption. It was an extraordinary alliance, Burgundy and Austrasia united. But it came with a cost. To secure Childebert's future, Brunhild could no longer support Marevech's rebellion. Her silence was deafening. The last ride, Marevech and Boso, now fugitives, tried to flee again. But Fredegund and Chilperic were hunting them. And this time, their trap worked. Boso sent Marevech a false letter, inviting him to the town of Terouanne. When he arrived, Chilperic's soldiers were waiting, cornered, wounded, and betrayed. Marevech turned to his loyal friend Galen and whispered one final request: don't let them take me alive. Galen obeyed. The sword fell. The rebellion ended. Justice denied. In Paris, Bishop Pretextatus, the man who married Marevech and Brunhild, was dragged before a church council. Chilperic accused him of treason. Fredegund accused him of plotting regicide. The bishop refused to confess. Gregory of Tours, watching with horror, noted the torture used, the bribes offered, the lies whispered in every corner. Eventually, under pressure, Pretextatus confessed. He was beaten, stripped of rank, exiled. Another piece removed from Brunhild's chessboard. The quiet queen, the poisoned court, with Marevech dead, and Pretextatus disgraced. Fredegund solidified her grip. She bore another son, Dagobert, a name that meant bright day. She and Chilperic celebrated with games, feasts, and hunts. The court moved to Paris. Fredegund was no longer the servant girl. She was queen, advisor, and whisperer of power. But trouble always follows power. In 580, a great epidemic struck the Frankish lands. Rain flooded the fields. Dysentery swept through cities. And rumors, whispers of scandal, followed the sickness. Some said Fredegund was sleeping with Bishop Bertram of Bordeaux. Others said she had bewitched her husband. Gregory of Tours, ever bold, recorded the rumors, and so Fredegund summoned him to court. She was not done yet. Autumn 580. The Frankish world was choking on rain, on rot, on fear. A cruel epidemic swept the kingdoms. Crops withered under cold downpours. The rivers flooded the valleys. Dysentery carved its way through cities. From noble court to peasant village, children died in cradles. Bishops dropped mid-sermon. Even kings prayed for mercy. And still, Fredegund thrived. Rumors had begun to stick to her name like soot to skin. They said she had taken Bishop Bertram of Bordeaux as a lover. They said her son's father might not be Chilperic at all. To a woman like Fredegund, rumors were more than insults. They were threats, and she had never taken threats lightly. The trial of Gregory. Enter Gregory of Tours, bishop, writer, and reluctant chronicler of chaos. Gregory, a nobleman by birth, had long harbored suspicion toward Fredegund. He had accused her of ordering Galswintha's murder, manipulating Chilperic, and orchestrating Mariveche's fall. When word reached Fredegund that Gregory had repeated rumors of her affair, she struck back. Gregory was summoned to court, accused of treason and libel. He arrived in Paris under heavy guard, surrounded by enemies, and knowing full well that he might not leave alive. Fredegund confronted him herself, her voice soft, calm, lethal. She asked him to swear, publicly, that he had not slandered her. Gregory, stubborn, proud, and devout, refused to confess. He argued that he had only repeated what others had said, that it was not slander if it was already common knowledge. That truth, however uncomfortable, could not be treason, but truth, in a Merovingian court, was a dangerous luxury. Chilperic offered Gregory a bribe, recant, and all would be forgiven. Fredegund offered a threat, persist, and face the consequences. Gregory refused both. He fasted, he prayed, and then, miraculously, he was acquitted. Why? Perhaps Fredegund feared that killing Gregory would provoke the church. Perhaps Chilperic feared God. Either way, Gregory lived, but he never forgot, and in his great Historia Francorum, he would carve Fredegund's name into the annals of hell. The Spider Queen, Fredegund, meanwhile, was not finished spinning. She focused on securing her children's future, particularly her son Clotaire. He was now her only legitimate heir, small, fragile, and marked for greatness. Her enemies were many. Brunhild, though trapped in Austrasia, still wielded influence. Her son Childebert II was growing, and the boy had Guntram's backing. Together, they represented a united East, a threat to Fredegund's fragile Neustria. Fredegund knew she couldn't strike openly. So, she turned again to poison. Her favored weapon: bottles, vials, powders, gifted in friendship, consumed in trust. Some died quietly, others slowly. A few survived, but were never the same. And always, Fredegund walked away clean. The death of Chilperic. Then, suddenly, Chilperic died. It happened in 584, under circumstances that still stir historians' curiosity. The king had gone hawking, enjoying the first dry days of autumn. When he returned to his villa outside Paris, he was ambushed. An assassin, hidden in the shadows, leapt from the reeds. 2 quick stabs, a burst of blood, a fallen crown. Chilperic, king of Neustria, husband to 2 queens, father of many heirs, died with no final words. His killer was never found. And in the silence that followed, one name filled the court's whispering halls: Fredegund. No one said it aloud, but everyone wondered. Widowmaker. Now, Fredegund was where she had always longed to be, alone atop a throne of blood. But power is cold comfort when the walls are closing in. Neustria was vulnerable. Fredegund's son Clotaire II was only a baby. Austrasia had Childebert, now a teenager, and backed by Guntram. Fredegund's position depended entirely on loyalty, which could be bought, and often was, but also easily broken. She made herself regent, took control of the treasury, ordered executions, crushed dissent. She even had bishop pretext status. Recently returned from exile, stabbed on Easter Sunday in his own cathedral. When the bishop lingered, dying slowly over 6 days, she visited him personally. He told her, in front of witnesses, "You are the one who sent the knife." She said nothing, and he died. Queen versus queen. By now, the Frankish world had 2 centers of gravity. In Austrasia, Brunhild ruled beside her son, increasingly confident, increasingly imperial. In Neustria, Fredegund ruled in the name of her child, increasingly feared, increasingly ruthless. They had never met face to face, but their war was one of whispers, spies, and steel. Fredegund sent assassins. Brunhild sent alliances. Fredegund bribed nobles. Brunhild married them. Their weapons were different, but their aim was the same, to outlast. A new generation rises. As Childebert II reached adulthood, he became more than a symbol. He was a king in his own right, educated, fluent in Latin, confident in war. In 585, he led a campaign into Neustria, backed by Guntram and supported by Brunhild's strategy. Fredegund's forces were driven back again and again. Entire regions turned against her. But she was never out. Even as her soldiers lost ground, her spies gained ground, undermining cities from within, poisoning food stores, sowing distrust. Then in 587, disaster struck. Guntram's only remaining son was murdered, probably by his own nobles. With no heir, the aging king signed the Treaty of Andelot, formally adopting Childebert II as his successor. It was Brunhild's greatest triumph. Now, her son stood to inherit Austrasia and Burgundy. And once Fredegund fell, Neustria too. 3 kingdoms, 1 line, 1 queen behind the throne. It should have been the end. But Fredegund wasn't done yet. Blood and ashes. It was the winter of 587, and the Frankish world, though momentarily paused, was far from at peace. Fredegund, now widow and regent of Neustria, had lost battlefields, bishops, and noble allies, but not her will. She ruled from Soissons, surrounded by shadows and silence. Her son, Clotaire II, barely a toddler, wore a crown far too large for his brow. But Fredegund made sure everyone saw it, and bowed. If anyone questioned her authority, she reminded them of what happened to Pretextatus, or to Chilperic's enemies, or to Marivech, her stepson, who had vanished into unmarked graves. She had made herself the spider at the center of a shrinking web, twitching each silken thread with deliberate cruelty. And across the forests and valleys of Gaul, another queen watched her from afar. Brunhild ascendant. In Metz, Brunhild's world was brighter. Her son, Childebert II, was now a young man, a king not just in name, but in presence. He had inherited Sigebert's caution and his mother's steel. Under her guidance, he had forged bonds with the Visigoths, secured alliances with Guntram, and grown a network of loyal nobles. Brunhild kept her court bathed in Roman dignity, velvet tapestries, mosaic floors, speeches in Latin. Her power, unlike Fredegund's, was worn openly. Where Fredegund ruled with knives in the dark, Brunhild wielded law, ritual, and dynasty. And yet, even in success, she knew the truth. Power in the Merovingian world was always fragile. It depended on heirs, on loyalties, on outliving your enemies. So she watched, she waited, and she made plans. The children of war. In Neustria, Clotaire II was growing, small, sickly, but sharp. He learned early to say nothing, He watched his mother closely, studied her every word. He saw fear in the eyes of her courtiers and understood survival meant silence. In Austrasia, Childebert II grew into his role as king. But his siblings multiplied. Brunhild's other children, daughters, were married off like queens from a chessboard. One to a Visigothic prince, securing Spain. Another into Lombard lands, touching Italy. A third, promised to a Burgundian noble, tying up Guntram's faction. Each marriage was a thread pulled tight. Each child, a pawn or player, depending on the mother behind them. And behind them all, Brunhild, now grey at the temples. But still striking, still feared. Fredegund strikes back. In 589, Fredegund began her counter-offensive. She couldn't outmatch Brunhild in alliances or diplomacy. So she returned to the tools she trusted most: murder, money, and fear. First, she sent assassins into Burgundy, some disguised as monks, others as beggars. Guntram's guards grew paranoid. Some cities closed their gates entirely. Then she turned to Spain, intercepting envoys between the Visigothic court and Metz, replacing documents, sowing confusion. When that failed, she tried poisoning the water of a monastery where a Frankish princess was staying. Even in failure, her message was clear: you are never safe, not even in prayer. Brunhild responded with force. In 590, Childebert II marched on Neustria again, this time reaching as far as Rouen. Cities surrendered. Bishops switched sides. Even some of Fredegund's noble allies defected. But Fredegund had one more move. The Battle of Droisy. In late 590, near the small village of Droisy, the two queens' forces clashed. Childebert's army, numbering perhaps 20,000, was led by seasoned generals and reinforced by Burgundian cavalry. Fredegund, though outnumbered, had fortified her position and taken a desperate step. She commanded the battle herself. Clad in armor, her hair braided back, she stood beside her captains, issuing orders, rallying troops. She had nothing left to lose. Her strategy: brutal ambush. She baited Childebert into open terrain, then struck with hidden archers and swift infantry, men paid in gold and promised land. The battle was vicious. Childebert's right flank collapsed. His left held. The center swayed. By nightfall, the field was littered with Frankish dead. But Fredegund had survived, and that alone was a victory. The Treaty of the Broken Oath. After Droisy, Childebert sued for peace. Guntram, aging and wary, pushed for compromise. In 591, a temporary treaty was signed. Brunhild, furious but pragmatic, accepted. She had not destroyed Fredegund, but she had wounded her. Neustria was still fractured, its finances bleeding, and Fredegund's health was failing. Her once pale skin was now sallow. Some said her joints swelled, and she screamed at night. But she held on, for Clotaire. And then, suddenly, Childebert died. A shattered crown. It was 595. Childebert II, barely 26, died of a fever in his palace at Metz. Some say it was illness. Others whispered, always whispered, that Fredegund's hand had reached even there. He left behind two young sons, Theodebert in Austrasia and Theoderic in Burgundy. Brunhild, now a grandmother, refused to step aside. She declared herself regent to both boys, holding the East again, but with her son dead. The unity she had dreamed of began to crack. Nobles in Burgundy resented her rule. Austrasian factions whispered that the Queen Mother had overstepped. And worst of all, Guntram was dead too. There was no elder statesman to balance the chaos. No ally with enough weight to keep the peace. And in Neustria, Fredegund was gone at last, but her son Clotaire too was rising. The next generation. When Fredegund died, likely in 597, some said in agony, Clotaire too was ready. He had learned his mother's lessons. He kept her spies, her allies, even some of her old enemies. And he waited. He let Brunhild wear her crown. Let her overextend. Let her burn through nobles and favors. One by one, by the time he struck, he would strike clean. But that tale of betrayal, civil war, and final vengeance belonged to another chapter. After the sudden death of Childebert II in 595, his realm was left divided between his two young sons. Theodebert II, age 7, was declared king of Austrasia. Theoderic II, age 5, was crowned king of Burgundy. But everyone knew who really held the power: Brunhild. The grandmother turned regent took firm control of both courts, determined to preserve her dynasty's place in Frankish history. For a time, it worked. She placed loyal nobles in key positions. She controlled the treasuries, the armies, and even the royal seals. She summoned bishops and commanded embassies. The courts of Metz and Orléans trembled at her presence. But beneath the gold-stitched robes and polished floors, something had changed. Brunhild was alone. Her son was dead. Her daughters were far away in foreign lands. Her most trusted ally, Guntram, had passed. And the nobles, especially the Frankish warrior aristocracy, were growing restless. A generation of wolves. The court of Austrasia was no longer the refined space she had built with Sigebert. Theodebert, though intelligent, was willful and proud. He bristled at his grandmother's control and began to surround himself with ambitious young advisors who whispered of freedom and masculine rule. In Burgundy, Theoderic II was quieter, more thoughtful, but easily manipulated. As he came of age, he too began to resent being treated like a child king in a grown woman's world. Brunhild had raised them like heirs of Rome, disciplined, devout, visionary. But they were Franks, and the Frankish nobility wanted kings who drank, rode hard, waged war, and took spoils, not queens who quoted Latin poetry and invoked imperial law. It was only a matter of time before the tension boiled over. The turning. By 600, the two brothers, Theodebert and Theoderic, were no longer allies. Each had been raised in different cities, surrounded by different factions, and influenced by different noble houses. Brunhild's hold on Burgundy had started to slip. Theoderic's advisors whispered poison, claiming that Brunhild favored his brother, that she sought to crown Theodebert as sole king. At the same time, in Austrasia, Theodebert was growing bold. He accused his grandmother of hoarding wealth, of favoring the church over the army, and even, when angered, of causing his father's death. Brunhild, once feared, now had to beg for loyalty, bribe with treasure, and watch her words. Her political network, built over 3 decades, was unraveling thread by thread. In 603, it all broke. The Brother War. Theodebert and Theoderic, brothers by blood, declared war on each other. The Frankish world watched in disbelief as two children of Brunhild raised armies and clashed across the hills and rivers of eastern Gaul. Their battles were messy, blood-soaked, and brutal. Villages burned, bishops were arrested, entire noble houses were wiped out. Brunhild, devastated, tried to mediate, but both grandsons refused her voice. Theodebert accused her of favoring Theoderic. Theoderic accused her of manipulating both. For the first time in her life, Brunhild was powerless in a war of her own blood. But she had not yet lost. A pact with the past. In 604, with her influence in tatters, Brunhild turned to a name once whispered in dread, Clotaire II. Now a grown man, the son of Fredegund had become king of Neustria. For decades, he had played a cautious game, consolidating his kingdom, rewarding allies, and avoiding open war. He had no love for Brunhild, his mother's greatest enemy, but he saw an opportunity. Brunhild offered recognition, neutrality, and even a marriage alliance. In return, Clotaire agreed to stay out of the brother war, at least for now. But behind the smiles, both sides knew the truth. This was a pause, not peace. Betrayal at Toul. By 610, Theoderic II, guided by his sly and violent general Protadius, had defeated his brother. Theodebert II was captured near Toul, deposed, and sent to a monastery, where he was soon murdered, likely on Theoderic's orders. His children, mere toddlers, were thrown into the river, their small bodies swept away like trash. Theoderic became king of both Austrasia and Burgundy, and once more, Brunhild returned to power, this time, as regent and advisor to the last living heir of her line. But the queen had changed. Years of betrayal, exile, heartbreak, and war had hardened her. She no longer played the noble Roman widow. She was a steel-eyed monarch, unafraid to use force and execute nobles who challenged her. And so, even Theoderic, her last grandson, began to fear her. Clotaire II returns. In 613, everything collapsed. Theoderic II died suddenly, again, of fever. Some whispered Brunhild had poisoned him. Fearing his growing independence, once more, a child inherited the throne, Siegbert II, age 11, and once more, Brunhild declared herself regent. But this time, the nobility refused. They had watched 30 years of warfare. They had seen Brunhild's enemies fall. One by one, they had seen brothers pitted against brothers. Cities burned, royal children drowned. They blamed her for everything. And so they turned to Clotaire II. He invaded, and noble after noble defected to him. The end of the empress. Brunhild fled with young Siegbert II and her remaining allies. But she was cornered, captured, and handed over to Clotaire. The boy king was executed, his loyal guards massacred, and Brunhild, queen of queens, empress of ambition, was dragged before the Neustrian court in chains. She was accused of the murders of 10 kings and princes, sorcery, treason, incest. There was no trial, no defense. She was tied to the back of a wild horse and dragged to death, her body torn apart across miles of field and stone. Witnesses said the dust rose red behind her like a comet. She was 70 years old. Aftermath. Clotaire II stood alone as king of the Franks. He immediately rewrote history, portraying himself as a unifier, a restorer, a king of peace. Brunhild was vilified in every chronicle. Her memory twisted into that of a witch, a murderess, a harpy. But the truth was more complex. She had outlived Sigebert, Chilperic, Fredegund, Guntram, Gregory, and her sons and grandsons. She had ruled longer than any other Frankish queen. She had built roads, supported bishops, founded cities, and held her own in a world designed to break women. And in the echo of her death, even her enemies remembered her name. Dust settles on a blood-soaked century. After Brunhild's execution in 613, the Frankish world entered a strange quiet. Gone were the brother wars, the queenly intrigues, and the assassins with poisoned blades. Clotaire II now ruled as the sole king of the Franks. He published the Edict of Paris, trying to stabilize the kingdom. He gave privileges to the nobility, strengthened the church, and brought a semblance of unity to the realm. But peace was bought at a price: the erasure of the woman who had shaped the century. Brunhild's name was scrubbed from records, her buildings claimed by others, her policies reversed. She became a story told in whispers, part cautionary tale, part horror myth, the making of a monster. The bishops who had once sought her favor now wrote sermons about her vanity and wrath. Gregory of Tours, who had died before her fall, left behind writings that painted her as cunning, but not monstrous. Yet later chroniclers, influenced by Clotair's court, took it further. They accused her of sleeping with her grandsons, killing 10 kings, using dark magic, driving the Franks to near collapse. A woman who governed for nearly 5 decades was reduced to a caricature, a dangerous old witch who refused to die. But even as the legends darkened, something else endured. The road she built. Though her enemies tried to erase her, they could not undo her works. The roads she commissioned still stretched across the Frankish lands. Her churches stood, weathered but upright. Her political reforms lived on, forming the backbone of Merovingian bureaucracy. She had supported monasticism, education, and law. She had bridged Roman traditions with Frankish rule. She had outlasted every man who tried to bring her down. And centuries later, some monks, far from Clotair's reach, began writing her name again. A memory reclaimed. In the 9th century, a new wave of chroniclers emerged. They were not Frankish nobles nor hostile bishops, but monks in Spain and Italy. They saw Brunhild as a tragic heroine, betrayed by her kin and scapegoated by politics. Some even likened her to Byzantine empresses, intelligent, commanding, doomed. By the Middle Ages, French poets had begun weaving her into chansons de geste, epic tales of legendary queens. Later historians, centuries removed, began to study her with fresh eyes. History's judgment. So, who was Brunhild? A Visigothic princess raised in the luxury of Toledo, taught to love Rome and virtue. A Frankish queen who married for peace, then fought for her life. A widow who ruled with resolve, raising children in exile and forging alliances across borders. A grandmother who watched her bloodline devour itself. A political genius, a flawed survivor, and perhaps the last Roman queen of the West. She was no saint, but in a world where kings murdered their own sons, where queens were tossed aside like worn-out cloaks, and where loyalty shifted with every wind, Brunhild endured. The wind in the grass. Somewhere in modern-day France, near the fields where she was dragged to her death, the grass grows long and soft. There is no great monument, no triumphal arch, no sacred chapel with her name in gold. But beneath that soil, beneath the centuries of silence, lies the story of a woman who dared to rule. And if you stand there, on a still day, and close your eyes, you might just hear her name in the wind, long before her name echoed through the fearful halls of Frankish palaces. Long before she was condemned as a sorceress, a widow, and a queen who clung too long to. Born beneath the warm sun of the Iberian Peninsula, Brunhild entered the world not into obscurity, but into a dynasty that called itself chosen by God. She was a Visigothic princess, daughter of King Athanagild and Queen Goaswintha, a child of fierce legacy and whispered expectations. The court of Toledo was proud, Romanized, and austere. It was a place of carved marble and holy relics, of bishops who debated eternity in Latin, and nobles who passed judgment in the shade of courtyard. Brunhild's early years unfolded among relics of empire and the slow crumble of certainty. The Visigothic kingdom, stretching across much of Spain, was strong but not united. Pagan traditions still flickered in the shadows, and rival warlords cast long glances toward the throne. But the royal daughters were raised with clarity of purpose. They were to be the faces of dynasty. And Brunhild was exceptional. She could read Latin fluently before she was 10. She memorized hymns, laws, and histories as other girls learned embroidery. Her tutors whispered that she had a mind sharper than many lords. But even that could not prepare when she was barely into her teenage years. Messengers arrived from the north, riders cloaked in the dust of long roads, bearing the wax-sealed offer of marriage from a king of the Fra. He was no Roman. His realm, the easternmost of the Frankish kingdoms, stretched across forests and rivers, across lands where Latin had decayed into Germanic tongues and where kings were crowned by lifting them on shields. He was not even the most powerful of his brothers. But Sigebert sought legitimacy, and Brunhild, young, educated, and noble, offered him a direct line to Rome and the divine authority of her blood. The proposal was accepted, and so, with stately ritual, Brunhild departed the warmth of Toledo, her family, her native tongue, her Visigothic land, to journey toward the unknown. Fade in distant hoofbeats, river crossings, and murmured farewells. Her sister Galswintha wept. Their mother gave a blessing but kept her face carved in stone. For this was the fate of noble daughters, to marry power. Wherever it lived, the road north wound through valleys and hills, and the air grew colder. Frankish lands were less polished than Brunhild imagined. She found cities rough, the court customs unfamiliar, the feasting louder and less graceful than in Toledo. But Sigebert was a surprise. He was not handsome by the ideals of southern courts, but he was commanding, stern, intelligent, cautious. He greeted Brunhild not with indifference, but respect. He marveled at her education, and soon made it known that she would not be a silent wife. He consulted her, listened, even trusted her. Their wedding, held in Metz, was one of ceremony and spectacle. Poets described it as a new golden age. Fortunatus, a Roman poet seeking favor, wrote verses praising Brunhild's grace and comparing her to imperial brides of the past. The people cheered, the court celebrated, even rival nobles seemed to accept her, for now. Brunhild was not naive. She could see the suspicion in the eyes of certain lords, and above all, from one woman whose name was whispered more often than spoken, Fredegund. At this time, Fredegund was still only a concubine of Chilperic, Sigebert's brother and rival, but already, she wielded influence behind the curtains of power. She was ambitious, cunning, and dangerous. Brunhild would remember her eyes, not cold, but calculating. But those dangers seemed distant in the early days of marriage. Brunhild bore Sigebert a daughter, and joy swept the palace. Sigebert himself had secured his alliance, gained a Roman bride, and now had a legitimate heir. In those rarest of moments, peace seemed possible among the Merovingians. But then, fate shifted. Chilperic, not to be outdone by his brother's marriage to a Visigothic princess, sent a proposal of his own to Brunhild's sister, Galswintha. The younger princess arrived in Francia in 568, less than 2 years after her sister. Her welcome was grand. Chilperic gave her lands, gifts, cities, even a morganatic gift so vast it stunned the court. But Galswintha soon discovered the truth behind the throne. Fredegund was still there, hidden but watching. Chilperic had not abandoned her. Galswintha complained to her sister. Letters traveled between Metz and Soissons. Brunhild urged patience, but the palace in Neustria grew colder by the day. Then, tragedy. One morning, Galswintha was found dead, strangled in her bedchamber. No thief had entered, no assassin had fled, and within days, Chilperic married Fredegund, the woman Galswintha had feared. A murder, a stolen throne, and a sister torn from life. Her dowry seized. Brunhild was devastated, alone now in a foreign land. She mourned not just a sibling, but a fragile bridge to her homeland. The court in Spain was outraged. Sigebert, too, grieved, but then he moved. This death, he declared, would not go unanswered. Brunhild watched as her husband prepared for war. She would soon learn that in Frankish lands, mourning could become motive, and blood had a way of demanding more blood. But she also saw something else. That in this world of warlords and bishops, of shifting lands and deadly unions, a queen, if she were bold enough, clever enough, and unrelenting enough, might yet carve her own place. She would grieve Galswintha, but she would not forget, nor forgive. The War of Queens was about to begin. The snow had long melted from the fields of Austrasia, revealing the battered roads and broken hearts left in the wake of war. Brunhild stood once again beneath the vaulted ceiling of her palace in Metz, not as a young bride, not as a foreigner, not even as a widow this time, but as a queen who had clawed her way back from political Anna. The death of Sigebert had been a blow that could have shattered any other woman. But Brunhild was not any other woman. Her gaze was colder now, sharper, her movements more calculated. The warm girl from Visigothic Spain, once fascinated by courtly poetry and Roman A. Her son, Childebert, barely 5, was the last flickering ember of her late husband's legacy, and the key to Brunhild's future. She wrapped her life around him like armor. Every move she made from this point forward would be in his name. But always, always for her own survival. In Paris, her enemy reigned. Fredegund, too, had changed, no longer a mere palace slave or the mistress in the shadows. She was now queen of Neustria, crowned not by ceremony, but by the brutal extinguishing of every rival. Sigebert's assassination, whispered to have been carried out at her command, had sealed her place beside Chilperic. She had sons now, heirs of her own blood, and more importantly, power. But unlike Brunhild, Fredegund's rule was a tempest. She did not calculate, she erupted. Her enemies didn't fear her strategy, they feared her madness. Her unpredictability. One moment, a gracious hostess, the next, the cruelest architect of death. Two queens now divided the Frankish world. One, poised and deliberate, the other, feral and swift. Two women, forged by love, betrayal, and blood, and between them, everything that mattered. The years that followed Sigebert's death were anything but peaceful. Chilperic, drunk on vengeance and emboldened by Fredegund's cunning, launched attacks across Austrasia's borders. He raided cities, laid siege to territories once granted as part of Galswintha's dowry. Fredegund's hand could be seen in the quick strikes, the poisonings, the untraceable assassinations that followed. No fortress seemed safe, no noble beyond suspicion. Brunhild countered as best she could. She secured the loyalty of key nobles by giving titles and land in Childebert's name. She surrounded herself with loyal men. Go. Her late husband's advisor, Duke Wolf, a battle-hardened noble of Champagne, and Bishop Gregory of Tours, a wily churchman who understood power as well as any politician. And in the south, her old ally Duke Boso, who had once betrayed her but now returned seeking absolution, served again. She tolerated him, for now. She had learned. Trust was a luxury. But what Brunhild needed most was not soldiers or spies, it was legitimacy. And in a world ruled by swords and sacred oaths, there were only two paths to that kind of power: marriage, or murder. And so she chose both. In the shadowed halls of a convent in Rouen, once meant to confine her, Brunhild found something unexpected, an ally. Odivera, Chilperic's discarded first wife, had been sent here long ago after Fredegund's rise. She too had sons, pushed aside, endangered by the growing influence of Fredegund's heirs. Together, the two women saw a narrow, dangerous opportunity. Odivera's eldest surviving son, Marevech, was a rising military commander. Young, ambitious, increasingly disillusioned with his father. If Brunhild married him, it would unify the bloodlines of Austrasia and Neustria. She would return as queen, not of a broken realm, but of both. And so, in secret, using the old Roman networks of bishops and abbesses loyal to her cause. The plan was laid. Messages slipped through courtyards and sanctuaries. Vows were whispered in candlelit cloisters. The impossible took form. Marevech arrived in Rouen in the dead of night, the clatter of his horse muffled by fresh moss. The cathedral was empty. There were no trumpets, no clergy in gold, no cheering nobles. Just a quiet priest, loyal to Gregory, just Brunhild in a stolen dress. Her face veiled more by determination than lace. They married. The alliance was sealed. But secrets do not keep in royal courts. Chilperic heard of the wedding and flew into a rage. He gathered his troops and marched on Rouen. The gates closed just in time. And inside, Brunhild and Marevech prepared for siege. They hoped to appeal to Chilperic's sentiment, pretending the marriage was the result of reckless love, not rebellion. But Chilperic was not a man easily fooled. And Fredegund, watching from the shadows, saw the greater threat, not just a son's betrayal, but the return of Brunhild, the survivor. She whispered in Chilperic's ear, as she always did. And so, after an uneasy truce, the king returned to Paris. But it was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Marevech was first disowned, then tonsured, his royal hair shorn off in disgrace, marking him forever as a monk. Brunhild, under threat of execution, was sent back to Austrasia with her daughters. She left her treasure behind with Bishop Pretextatus, ensuring funds for the next rebellion. It was not a defeat. It was a recalibration, because Brunhild returned to Metz not as a captive, but as queen mother. Her son, Childebert II, had been crowned, her allies had remained loyal, and her enemies had revealed themselves. Now, she knew exactly who must fall. Meanwhile, in Neustria, Fredegund's rule became darker. Assassinations were no longer scandal, they were routine. Nobles dropped dead at feasts. Priests vanished on pilgrimages. Even Chilperic began to fear her. When two of his elder sons died under mysterious circumstances, suspicion turned inward. Had Fredegund killed them to secure her own son's succession? He didn't dare ask. Instead, Chilperic turned on Brunhild's network. He summoned Bishop Pretextatus to trial, accusing him of treason, sedition, and conspiracy. In the Hall of Judgment, the bishop stood defiant. Gregory of Tours watched from the gallery, knowing that one false word could damn them both. Fredegund offered bribes, then threats. Still the bishop refused to betray Brunhild. And so, under pressure from cowed clergy, Pretextatus was condemned, beaten, stripped of rank, sent into exile. But Brunhild's vengeance would not be denied forever. Marevech, her one-time husband, was captured, lured into a trap by Duke Boso, who had again switched sides. Facing humiliation and torture, Marevech begged his companion Galen to kill him. The sword was swift. The rebellion ended in silence. But the tale of the two queens was far from over. Because the deaths did not stop. Chilperic, now increasingly paranoid, was found dead in the autumn of 584. Stabbed, assassinated. Some said it was a servant. Others whispered of political rivals. But most blamed Fredegund. Whether she ordered it or merely survived it, she was now alone. A queen without a king. But not without a plan. She gathered her children. She secured the throne. And in the vacuum left by Chilperic's death, she prepared to rule as regent. Her son, Clothar II, barely a toddler, would be king. But the real power? That belonged to her. And so the stage was set once again. Two women, two sons, two futures. Brunhild, ruling as queen mother from Metz, guided Childebert's reign with an iron hand wrapped in velvet. She passed laws, restructured the court, formed foreign alliances with the Visigoths and Byzantines. Her hand touched every document, every decision. She was no longer simply a queen. She was a sovereign. And in Neustria, Fredegund ruled with blades and whispers. She destroyed her enemies in the dark. One by one, her influence was absolute, her reputation, fearsome. For nearly 2 decades, they stared across the battlefield of politics, each waiting, each plotting. But the final confrontation was still to come. In the dim corridors of the Frankish courts, whispers held as much power as swords. Brunhild, though bruised by defeat, was far from broken. Her return to Austrasia in the aftermath of betrayal was not a retreat. It was a recalibration. She had chosen her children over ambition, survival over spectacle, and now, back in Metz, she would begin to weave her power quietly, almost invisibly. Through the Very, she arrived not as a triumphant queen, but as a widow, again. Yet her arrival was not ignored. The boy King Childebert II, her son, was only 5 years old, but his eyes clung to his mother as if sensing the gravity of what she had endured. She had lost Sigebert to an assassin's blade, Merivek to politics and betrayal, and her influence over half a kingdom in Amat, Austrasia, too, was licking its wounds. The nobles were anxious, disorganized. With a child on the throne, the entire court hovered on the edge of chaos. Into this, Brunhild stepped, not as a queen, but as the boy's regent in all but name. The palace may not have crowned her again, but everyone, from chambermaids to dukes, knew who was truly ruling. Her allies Go and Duke Wolf stood by her. These were men loyal not only to the bloodline but to Brunhild's vision, a Frankish kingdom guided by Roman order. Religious reform, instability. She still held her treasure, smuggled through the conflict and entrusted to Bishop Pretextatus. This gold was more than currency, it was her leverage, her future. But not all her enemies had been defeated. Fredegund, still at Chilperic's side in Neustria, continued to act like a shadow monarch herself. Her position had only grown more secure since the birth of her sons. And like Brunhild, she understood that influence was not always about visible power. In Austrasia, Brunhild turned her energies to the realm of governance. Roads were repaired, churches received patronage, education was encouraged among the elite. She made strategic marriages, most notably arranging her daughter Ingun's marriage to the Visigothic prince Hermenegild in Spain. This was not merely a match of diplomacy, it was a re-forging of her family's southern roots. A symbolic reach back to the court. But peace, as always in the Frankish kingdoms, was a fragile fiction. In Neustria, Chilperic, no longer as youthful or impulsive, began consolidating power in new ways. Fredegund, once a whispering presence behind the throne, was now advising directly. Her ruthlessness had become legendary. Even in Metz, people told stories of how she orchestrated Sigebert's death, how she twisted her enemies' loyalty with gold. Threats, or worse, Gregory of Tours, Brunhild's ecclesiastical ally and the chief chronicler of this era, found himself in the middle of this growing tension. He was no friend of Fredegund. In his writings, she was the embodiment of darkness, a poisoner, a schemer, a shadow queen. He portrayed Brunhild in a brighter light, wise, stately, and wronged. But even Gregory knew that history was rarely so clean. Brunhild had, after all, married her nephew by marriage in a desperate bid to reclaim power. And Fredegund, though savage, was also a survivor of unimaginable constraint and exploitation. Each woman was operating within a brutal system that gave them no room for error and no path to power except through blood. Then, in 577, the course of the kingdoms shifted again. King Guntram of Burgundy, The elder brother, still holding onto his own patch of land, lost both of his teenage sons to disease. Suddenly airless, Guntram looked eastward and saw in Childebert II a possible successor. A young king, yes, but a legitimate one. And a boy being molded by a queen who understood both Visigothic pride and Roman governance. Brunhild seized the opportunity. Through careful diplomacy, she arranged for her son to be adopted by Guntram, effectively aligning Austrasia and Burgundy. The agreement was clear. Childebert would inherit Burgundy upon Guntram's death. In return, the war with Chilperic and Fredegund had to end. It was a bitter compromise for Brunhild. Peace meant that pursuing justice for Sigebert's assassination would be put aside. Marevech's death would go unanswered, and Fredegund would be allowed to remain, unchecked, at the heart of power in Neustria. But Brunhild had learned that vengeance meant nothing if it left your son without a throne. The years that followed were a time of rebuilding, not through fire and steel, but through ink and alliances. Brunhild governed in her son's name. Her hand felt in every law and appointment. She focused on stabilizing succession, elevating her allies, and maintaining the fragile balance among the three kingdoms. In Neustria, Fredegund too had shifted her strategy. Now the mother of surviving sons, she played a longer game, one that would ensure her child, not Brunhild's, would someday sit on a unified Frankish throne. But even as both queens played their parts, the Frankish world remained a stage of constant risk. Epidemics struck again and again. Crops failed. Whispers of rebellion never fully faded. The nobles were restless. The bishops were watching. And both Brunhild and Fredegund knew, too well, that their stories were far from over. As dusk falls over Metz and Paris, as torchlight flickers against the old Roman stones, you can almost hear them, two women, one in a nun's habit turned crown, the other from a kitchen to a throne, both still shaping the destiny of empires. And in the silence of the centuries, their footsteps still echo. The year is 580. Across the Frankish realms, thunderclouds gather, both in the skies and in the halls of power. Heavy rains have soaked the fields. The rivers, once sources of trade and sustenance, now surge dangerously past their banks. And then, as if summoned by some divine displeasure, a new plague spreads, dysentery. It does not care for birthright, wealth, or palace walls, from the peasantry to the nobility. It claims victims indiscriminately. In Neustria, this grim backdrop sets the stage for new scandals and tragedies. Rumors begin to coil like smoke around Fredegund, who now resides in the royal court of Paris. The whispers are dangerous. Some say she is engaged in a secret affair with Bertram, the Bishop of Bordeaux. It's a rumor Gregory of Tours, always her enemy, was quick to believe. But it wasn't Gregory who spread it. It was Count Ludist, the ambitious and vengeful former slave turned nobleman, a man whose rise in court came from cunning and cruelty in equal measure. The rumors are more than salacious gossip. In a world where a queen's power depends on her virtue, and a son's legitimacy is everything, such whispers threaten Fredegund's entire legacy. If her children were believed to be bastards, sons of a bishop instead of a king, then her life's work would unravel. Dagobert, the boy she called her bright day, might never wear a crown, and Fredegund will not allow that. So, in the smoky, secretive corners of the court, a plan is made. Gregory of Tours is summoned, accused of treason, of blasphemy, of slander. He is stunned. He had expected anger from Fredegund, but not this, a public trial. The full weight of the Neustrian court pressing down on him. The bishop, once the moral voice of Austrasia, now finds himself isolated. He pleads his innocence, even gains the sympathy of Fredegund's own daughter, Rigund, who fasts and prays for his safety, perhaps just to defy her mother. But Gregory, for all his fear, refuses to back down. He refuses bribes. He refuses false confession. Fredegund's trap tightens, but she cannot crush him completely, not yet. The trial, a circus of accusation and whispers, ends with Gregory humiliated, but still a bishop. Fredegund must bide her time. She has other enemies to deal with. For across the border, in Metz, Brunhild watches this unfold with weary eyes. She is no stranger to isolation or scandal. The rain has not spared Austrasia. The same disease that strikes Neustria claims lives here, too. And she, too, mourns. Her daughter, Ingend, married to the Visigothic prince Hermenegild, is now at the heart of a civil war in Spain. What was supposed to be a bond of peace has become a battlefield. Hermenegild has converted to Catholicism, defying his Arian father, King Leovigild. He is at war, not only with his family but with his own past. Ingend, Brunhild's beloved child, is caught in the storm. She flees with her son. The Visigothic court will not suffer a Catholic queen. Alone and exhausted, she tries to escape to Constantinople, but never makes it. In some accounts, she dies of illness, in others, she is murdered, her son taken from her. Brunhild receives only fragmented news, each letter like a dagger. Another daughter lost. The Frankish world continues to turn. Slowly, unmercifully. In Neustria, Chilperic, older now, heavier and grayer, pretends not to see the fractures within his own household. Fredegund's enemies remain strong. Her power, while considerable, relies increasingly on violence. Assassins are sent in the night. Poison appears at banquets. Men disappear. Bishops whisper. Nobles turn their faces away. And then, one evening in 584, it all collapses. Chilperic is found dead, stabbed outside his hunting lodge. No witnesses, no weapon, just a dead king, lying face down in the forest dirt, his blood soaking into the roots. Panic erupts in Neustria. There is no clear succession. Of all Fredegund's sons, only one, Clothar, survives. And he is still a child. Her enemies seize the moment. They begin plotting to divide the kingdom, to install a regency without her. But Fredegund, ever the tactician, does not flinch. She flees Paris with young Clothar and hides in the old Roman walls of Soissons. There, behind high stone and iron gates, she prepares for war. She sends envoys to Burgundy, to Austrasia, to anyone who will listen. She makes promises. She spins lies. She offers gold. And through it all, she waits for her moment. Brunhild, too, receives the news. Chilperic, her sister's murderer, her son's tormentor, her greatest rival, is dead. But any satisfaction is tempered. The danger has not passed. In Soissons, behind her walls, Fredegund remains a queen in all but name. Her child, Clothar too, is now the symbol of her cause. And she will raise him as a weapon. Brunhild has her own king now. Childebert II is nearly grown. Smart, devout, cautious. He has inherited both her ambition and Sigebert's cold pragmatism. Under his reign, Austrasia begins to regain stability. The roads are patrolled, the laws are enforced, nobles return to court, and Brunhild, though technically no longer regent, remains at the heart of decision-making. But the peace is fragile. Every Frankish kingdom is ruled by a child now, or ruled in their names by queens, regents, and nobles. The land groans under the weight of broken treaties and old grudges. It is a time of shadows, where alliances shift like fog. And betrayal is more common than rain. Brunhild and Fredegund, two queens born worlds apart, one from the sunlit courts of Spain, the other from a Frankish palace kitchen, are now the twin poles of an empire teetering on collapse. Their hands are stained, their minds are sharpened, and they are far from finished. As the rain continues to fall and winter grips the land, you can almost hear them, Brunhild, plotting beneath the golden mosaics of Metz, and Fredegund, whispering to her son in the cold halls of Soissons. They are not ghosts, not yet. They are still the queens of a kingdom at war with itself. The year is 585. The Frankish kingdoms lie in uneasy silence. The old generation is nearly gone. Kings are dead, nobles are scattered, and all that remains are the children, and the queens who rule in their names. In Neustria, young Clothar II clings to his mother's robes. Fredegund, widowed, feared, and relentless, rules from the fortress city of Soissons. Her kingdom is a shadow of what it once was, barely held together by loyalty paid in gold and fear. But she has what matters most, a surviving male heir. In Austrasia, across the fractured heart of Gaul, Brunhild stands in contrast, regal and unbroken. She rules beside her teenage son, Childebert II. He is king in name, but the people know the truth. She is the hand on the throne. The two women, who once might have been family, now see each other only through the fog of war and memory. Their rivalry, rooted in blood and betrayal, has become generational. Now, it is no longer just about power. It is about legacy. Back in Soissons, Fredegund is not idle. Her spies slither through every court, even into Burgundy, where King Guntram still rules. Aging but cautious, he has no living sons. And that makes his nephew, Childebert, the logical heir. Brunhild is strengthening this alliance daily, sending emissaries, gifts, and promises. She sees a future where Austrasia and Burgundy rule together under her son. Fredegund sees something else, extinction. So she acts. She sends poison to Guntram's court. It fails. She bribes his nobles. They refuse. She plots an assassination. The blade is turned away at the last moment. Each failure eats away at her position. But Fredegund is nothing if not resilient. Her son is growing, learning to speak, to ride, to command. She fills his head with stories of betrayal, of murdered fathers, of queens who would steal his crown. And he listens. Across the land, the people whisper. Some say the Frankish realms have become cursed, that nothing good will grow in soil watered with so much royal blood. But the queens do not believe in curses. They believe in strategy. In 587, diplomacy takes center stage. Brunhild and Childebert meet with King Guntram and sign the Treaty of Andelot. With this, Guntram adopts Childebert as his heir, cementing the bond between Austrasia and Burgundy. It's a devastating blow to Fredegund. Her son, Clothar, is left with only a fragment of Neustria and the uncertain loyalty of border nobles. But Brunhild's victory comes with a cost. Her son is growing into a man, handsome, clever, but increasingly independent. Where once he clung to her wisdom, now he seeks his own path. He listens to other advisors, weighs their counsel, and questions her decisions. A slow and painful truth begins to take root in Brunhild's mind. The stronger her son becomes, the less he will need her. Still, she does not let go. She surrounds him with loyalists, men like Duke Wintrio and Bishop Felix. She ensures his court reflects Roman order, clean streets, rebuilt churches, just laws. But behind the marble columns and the restored basilicas, the court whispers. Some call her a foreigner, others, a schemer, but most are simply afraid. Meanwhile, in Soissons, Fredegund sharpens her blade, figuratively and literally. She carries a small dagger now, always hidden in her sleeve. Her enemies die suddenly, some poisoned, others found hanging, still more vanish into the woods, never to return. She is not just feared. She is folklore. Mothers warn their children, "Do not speak ill of the queen, or the wind will carry your words to her ears." But despite her cruelty, Fredegund is effective. She holds her territory. She negotiates with the Bretons. She forces bishops to side with her by threatening their flocks. And when a noble rises against her, he dies. Quietly, efficiently. It is during this time that she re-establishes her influence at court. Her son, Clothar II, is growing into his role. Though still young, he is crowned officially in 590. Fredegund sits beside him, her presence more commanding than the boy's crown. The balance of power is delicate, like a blade edge. Then, in 592, fate takes a sudden turn. King Guntram of Burgundy dies, leaving no direct heirs. True to the Treaty of Andelot, his kingdom passes to Childebert II, who now rules both Austrasia and Burgundy. He is barely 20. Brunhild has achieved the dream she once shared with her husband Sigebert, uniting two kingdoms under their son. It is her greatest triumph. But it is also her moment of greatest danger. For now, her son truly rules. He begins to make decisions without her. He appoints nobles she disapproves of. He favors advisors who resent her control. And in his court, resentment toward Brunhild starts to fester. The Queen Mother becomes a symbol, for some, of Roman order and strength, for others, of overreaching power and foreign domination. In Neustria, Fredegund watches with glee. She knows that the only enemy more dangerous than a rival queen is a son who outgrows his mother. But Fredegund does not live to see the outcome. In the summer of 597, she dies, peacefully. Surprisingly, in her bed. For once, there is no blood. She is buried in the Church of Saint Vincent in Paris, beside her murdered husband, Chilperic, the queen who rose from slavery, who fought off nobles, queens, and fate itself, is gone, but she leaves behind her son, Clothar II. The boy is no longer a pawn. He has inherited her ambition, her cunning, and perhaps even her ruthlessness. With his mother gone, he begins to consolidate power, to rebuild the Neustrian court in his image. And Brunhild? She is still Queen Mother, still powerful, but now, she is alone. She has no husband, her sister is long dead, her allies have dwindled, and her son, her last true connection to power, has begun to drift beyond her reach. The Frankish kingdoms are once again poised for conflict. Two sons now rule, Clothar II in Neustria, and Childebert II in Austrasia and Burgundy. But the war is far from over. For legacy is not just what we leave behind. It is what we are willing to destroy to protect. The year is 597. Fredegund is dead, laid to rest in Paris, beneath carved stone and candlelight. Her bloodied legacy passes into the hands of her son, Clothar II. He is only 13 years old, but he is already the king of Neustria. The nobles whisper, will the boy survive without his mother? Will he be as ruthless? As cunning? As relentless? Across the fractured land, in Metz, Brunhild receives the news. The death of her oldest enemy brings no joy. She has outlived Fredegund, yes, but she feels no peace, only the tremors of change. She turns to her son, Childebert II, king of both Austrasia and Burgundy. He is 26, strong, charismatic, and ambitious, everything she once dreamed he would become. But something is wrong. He no longer consults her, no longer sits by her side in council, no longer looks to her as the guiding star. He is building his own court, populated with bishops and dukes who resent her influence. Many are jealous of her Visigothic heritage, her Roman reforms, her tight control over legal and financial matters. They call her arrogant, dangerous, a woman who acts like a king. And Childebert listens. In secret meetings, The nobles begin to plot. They fear she might marry again, that she might rule through another man, that she might try to dominate her grandsons as she did their father. And then, without warning, everything unravels. In the spring of 596, Childebert falls ill, violently. Suddenly, some whisper poison, others divine punishment. Within days, the young king is dead. Just like his father, Sigebert, just like his uncle, Chilperic. Brunhild is shattered, but she does not weep long. She cannot afford to. There are two young princes now, her grandsons, Theodebert and Theoderic, one for Austrasia, one for Burgundy. Brunhild steps back into power, not as mother now, but as grandmother, regent, queen once more. For nearly 2 decades, she had ruled behind her son. Now, she would rule for her grandsons. She divides her time between courts, giving orders, managing armies, raising kings. But Clothar too, Fredegund's son, has come of age. And he wants it all. Neustria is not enough. He looks east, to Burgundy and Austrasia. He remembers the stories his mother told him, of betrayal, of exile, of murder. He sees Brunhild not as a queen or a grandmother. He sees her as a tyrant. In 599, the long Cold War reignites. Brunhild rallies her allies, but they are fewer now. The dukes and bishops remember how she ruled with an iron hand. They question her decisions, her judgments, even her faith. Clothar moves quickly. He offers land to rebels, titles to nobles, pardons to turncoats. Soon, Burgundy is crumbling from within. One of Brunhild's grandsons, Theodebert of Austrasia, even begins secret correspondence with Clothar. Brunhild is surrounded by betrayal, and yet she does not falter. She builds roads, strengthens cities, sends out letters in elegant Latin commanding loyalty and order. Her energy seems eternal, her will unshakable, but time has grown cruel. Allies die, enemies multiply, her own grandsons begin to question her control. And then, in 612, another tragedy strikes. Her beloved grandson, Theodebert, is captured in battle by his own brother. Theoderic, Brunhild's other grandson, now swayed by jealous advisors. In a twist too brutal for fiction, Theoderic executes his brother. Brunhild watches as her family devours itself. One grandson is dead by the other's hand. Only Theoderic remains, but he is no longer hers. She has lost control. Theoderic surrounds himself with advisors who want Brunhild gone. Some whisper she killed his brother. Others say she seeks to poison him next. And in 613, when Theoderic suddenly dies, perhaps of illness, perhaps something darker, the whispers become shouts. Brunhild is 70 years old. And alone, her great-grandson, a boy of barely 10, becomes king. She tries, once more, to rule as regent. But now, even the bishops turn away. The nobles of Burgundy and Austrasia, exhausted by years of war, betrayal, and taxes, make a stunning decision. They defect to Clothar too. They send envoys. They promise loyalty. They give up their castles and oaths. And worst of all, they offer a gift. Brunhild, the woman who had ruled for 60 years, who had outlived kings, lovers, sisters, enemies, and sons. They capture her in Burgundy and deliver her in chains to Clothar, the son of Fredegund, the boy she once nearly destroyed. Now a man, now a king, and he is waiting. What follows is not a trial. It is vengeance. Brunhild is accused of the deaths of 10 kings, of treason, of sorcery, of arrogance. Clothar parades her through the cities. She is old, tired, furious, but unrepentant. They torture her for 3 days. Then, in front of a crowd, they tie her to a wild horse. Some say 3 horses, others 4. It doesn't matter. She is torn apart. Her body is scattered across the countryside. And so ends the life of one of the most remarkable women of the early medieval world. A queen, a warrior, a builder of cities, a mother, a grandmother, a survivor, a woman who dared to rule. History would remember her as evil, as monstrous, as power-hungry. But maybe, just maybe, she was simply ahead of her time. Because in the world of kings and blades and shifting loyalties, Brunhild did not just endure. She fought. And for a time, she won. Whispers of a queen. The wind moves softly through the old stones of Metz and Reims. Paris and Poitiers, through ruined walls and ancient basilicas where queens once knelt. Where bishops once plotted. Where armies once gathered at dawn. The name Brunhild has faded from most tongues. But in the 6th and 7th centuries, she was a storm, a queen who ruled not from behind a veil, but from the throne, a foreigner who brought Roman order to Frankish chaos, a mother who built dynasties, a grandmother who defied death itself, until it finally caught her. She survived the destruction of her kingdom, the murder of her sister, the assassination of her husband, the betrayal of her children, and when the world declared her done, she raised kings from cradles and rebuilt empires from ruins. Her greatest sin, perhaps, was that she ruled too well. In a time when queens were meant to smile quietly and pass the wine. Brunhild rewrote the rules, and the men around her, bishops, dukes, even sons, never forgave her for it. She has been remembered unfairly. Chroniclers like Gregory of Tours, loyal to her enemies, painted her as cold, arrogant, and cruel. They praised the scheming of men as strategy, and called her ambition a crime. But if we look closely, we see another story. We see a woman who built roads, strengthened laws, protected her bloodline with fierce devotion. A woman who negotiated with emperors, befriended nuns, and faced torture without begging for mercy. We see a woman who, for more than half a century, held her own in the deadly game of kings. And then there is Fredegund, her mirror and her match. The slave who rose to queenship. The cunning mind behind assassins' daggers and royal decrees. Their feud burned across decades, consumed kingdoms, and shaped the Frankish world. In a cruel twist of history, it is Fredegund's son, Clothar II, who reunites the Frankish kingdoms, after crushing the last queen. But the unification came at a cost. A century later, the Merovingian line would crumble into ceremonial puppets. Their real power passed into the hands of palace mayors. And then, from that fading bloodline, a new dynasty would rise. The Carolingians. And with them, a name destined for immortality, Charlemagne. But before Charlemagne, before the empire, before the Renaissance of Rome, there were the queens. Brunhild, Fredegund, Galswintha, Theodochild, women who were not passive players in the Game of Thrones, but masters of it. So tonight, when the world quiets and the lamps are low, remember the woman torn by horses. The queen who built cathedrals, who fought wars, who raised kings. And ask yourself, if she were a man, would we still call her a monster? Or would we call her? In the quiet shadows of early medieval Europe, when the Roman Empire had long since faded into legend, a new world was taking shape from the ruins. Vast forests stretched across the lands once ruled by emperors and senators, where tribes of Franks, Goths, and Saxons warred, married, and carved out kingdoms on the bones of the old empire. This was an era of change, of chaos, but also of possib. Amidst this tumultuous backdrop, two women rose from vastly different worlds but found their lives bound together by ambition, rivalry, and sheer will. Their stories are woven into the tangled history of the Merovingian kings, a dynasty known as much for its internecine blow. One was Brunhild, a princess born into the Gothic royal line, famed for her beauty, intelligence, and unyielding resolve. The other was Fredegund, a woman whose origins were shadowy, rumored to be a slave, but whose cunning and ruthlessness would shake the very foundations of Frankish power. These two queens, separated by birth but united by. This is not a story of chivalrous knights or shining paladins. It is not a tale of glory sung by bards in great halls. Instead, it is a chronicle of ruthless power struggles, a slow, grinding game of thrones where betrayal, poison, and political maneuvering were weapons. To understand this world, we must first leave behind the comforts of modern history and step into the rugged reality of 6th century Frankish lands. Here, the old Roman roads still cut through the countryside, but they lead not to emperors, but to warrior kings whose. Against this backdrop, the Merovingian kings struggled to maintain their grip on power. Their kingdom was divided among brothers, cousins, and rivals, each eager to carve out their own dominion. Their courts were filled with intrigues, nuns becoming queens, queens becoming prisoners, and sons murdered to secure thrones. In this violent chess game, women like Brunhild and Fredegund were not merely pawns but fierce players with their own ambitions and. Brunhild arrived in Austrasia, a land foreign to her native Gothic upbringing, to marry Sigebert, a Merovingian king known for his attempts to bring Roman order back to his domain. Educated and cultured, Brunhild sought to bring stability and refinement to a court still wild and often brutal. Yet, the path she chose would lead her into a world of danger and deception, where enemies lurked in shadows and allies were never quite what they seemed. Fredegund, by contrast, emerged from obscurity to become queen through a combination of cunning, ambition, and sheer force of will. As the wife of Chilperic, another Merovingian king, her path was marked by scandal, poisonings, and assassinations. The rumors that surrounded her painted her as a witch, a sorceress who manipulated men and fate alike. Whether these stories were true or the product of bitter political propaganda, her impact on the Frankish realm was undeniable. Their rivalry would ignite wars, topple kings, and redefine the future of the Frankish kingdoms. At stake was not just their own survival but the very soul of the Merovingian dynasty, a dynasty on the brink of decline, soon to be overshadowed by the rise of the Carolingians, who would usher in a new age. Tonight, we journey into the depths of this dark and fascinating chapter of history. We will follow Brunhild and Fredegund through triumph and tragedy, through moments of grace and acts of ruthless cruelty. Their stories are reminders of how power can corrupt, how ambition can consume, but also how resilience and strategy can carve out legacies that endure centuries later. So, settle in, let the flickering light and quiet of the night carry you back to a world where queens were warriors, and kingdoms were won not just on battlefields, but in whispered conversations, in secret alliances, and in the hearts of those brave enough to fight for their place in history. This is the story of Brunhild and Fredegund, the queens of blood and power in a time when survival demanded everything. The fractured realm, aftermath of Sherbert's fall. The death of Sherbert, excommunicated king of the Franks, sent shockwaves through a realm already teetering on the edge of chaos. The sacred grounds that once embraced the body of his grandfather Clovis, the legendary founder of the Merovingian dynasty, refused to claim him in death. Instead, Sherbert's remains were cast out to lie in an old Roman fort, an ignominious burial fit for a pagan, not a ruler who had imagined himself as heir to Roman glory. This symbolic rejection from both church and state marked more than the end of one king's reign. It heralded the unraveling of a fragile political order in the heart of early medieval Europe. Sherbert's death fractured the kingdom into competing factions led by his surviving brothers and rival nobles, each eager to claim a piece of the legacy, power, and riches left behind. It was a world where marriages were battles, alliances shifted with the seasons, and the throne was as much a prize for cunning and brutality as for bloodlines. A kingdom divided and vulnerable. Paris, the old capital and spiritual heart of the Frankish realm, was declared neutral territory, a rare attempt to maintain peace amid escalating hostilities. Yet beyond this fragile truce, the territories once united under Sherbert's crown were carved into patchworks of competing claims. Choleric, the hot-headed younger brother, seethed with resentment at the small and scattered domains he was allotted. Strategic cities like Tours and Poitiers, vital economic and military hubs, fell into the hands of Sigebert and Gontram, further inflaming Choleric's fury. The resentment quickly spilled over into military conflict. Choleric's invasions of Tours and Poitiers were repelled by forces loyal to Sigebert, led by none other than Tutubar, the very youth spared by Sigebert years before, who now found himself wielding power against his own family's ambitions. The blood feud between brothers, sons, and factions tore the kingdom's fabric further, leaving open wounds that would shape the Frankish world for decades. The Queen's Gambit, Brunhild's rise amidst chaos. Amidst this turbulence stood Brunhild, a Visigothic princess whose life had already been marked by loss, exile, and relentless ambition. Unlike the fleeting queens who had come before her, cast aside, silenced, or worse, Brunhild brought to the Frankish court a formidable combination of royal blood, political savvy, and an unyielding will to survive. Her marriage to Sigebert was not merely a union of kingdoms but a calculated move that promised to reshape the balance of power in Merovingian Gaul. Though surrounded by nobles who spoke a fractured Frankish tongue and courtiers enamored with boisterous epics rather than elegant Latin poetry, Brunhild adapted swiftly. She forged bonds where she could, most notably with the poet Fortunatus, whose learned presence brought her moments of intellectual refuge amidst the crude and often brutal Frankish court. Through Fortunatus's eloquent verses and her own growing network of allies, Brunhild began laying the groundwork for a new order, one where a queen's influence extended beyond the bedchamber into the very halls of power. The church's shadow and the struggle for legitimacy. The Merovingian king's relationship with the church was a constant source of tension. Sherbert's scandalous marriage to a nun and his excommunication by the Frankish bishops had set a precedent that neither church nor crown could ignore. The bishops wielded their spiritual authority as a political weapon, asserting their power not only over souls but over kings themselves. Brunhild's position, too, was shaped by this complex dynamic. She found allies in unexpected places, like Rodgund, a former queen turned austere nun whose religious influence stretched from Poitiers to Constantinople. Together, they navigated a world where sanctity and politics intertwined, where relics like the True Cross were not just holy objects but diplomatic tools wielded with care and cunning. The looming threats and the future of the Merovingians. As the brothers fought over territories and alliances, the wider world beyond Frankish borders watched with interest and apprehension. The Byzantine Empire in the east, ruled by the erratic Justin II and his formidable wife Sophia, sought to reclaim lost lands and influence through subtle diplomacy and strategic marriages. Meanwhile, Visigothic Spain and the Lombard kingdoms of Italy eyed the shifting power balance with opportunistic intent. For Brunhild and the Merovingians, survival was no longer guaranteed by blood alone. The fragile peace of the realm depended on deft political maneuvers, fragile alliances, and the unyielding determination of those who sought to bend history to their will. The death of Sherbert, the eldest Merovingian brother and former king of Paris, left the Frankish realm in disarray. His scandalous life, marked by controversial marriages and defiance of the Church, culminated not only in his excommunication but also in an inheritance crisis that would reshape the political landscape of early medieval Gaul. In the wake of his passing, 4 kingdoms became 3, as power-hungry siblings scrambled for dominion and treasure, while the downtrodden and dispossessed, like the shepherdess Thudchild and the embattled Queen Brunhild, maneuvered for survival and influence. Sherbert's death was the spark that ignited a brutal contest for control. His son, a fragile infant who never survived, left no clear heir to Paris's wealth and throne. Thudchild, the teenage shepherdess turned queen, whose child had died shortly after birth, now found herself cast aside. The nun Sherbert had married, a shocking affront to church law and tradition, had likewise passed, and Thudchild so. But the Frankish realm was no place for gentle reclamation. Thudchild's efforts to secure Sherbert's gold met with betrayal when Gontram, the crafty younger brother, feigned acceptance only to mock her and imprison her in a convent. Her fate was grim. Brunhild, the Visigothic princess married into this volatile Frankish court, found herself navigating a labyrinth of alliances and betrayals, settling into her palace in Metz, surrounded by remnants of Roman grandeur like the amphitheater repurposed for bear baiting. She faced a culture both crude and chaotic. Her sophisticated Latin and noble upbringing set her apart, yet Brunhild was no mere bystander. Educated, ambitious, and politically astute, she understood the precariousness of her position as a foreign queen. Her pregnancy with a daughter was a bittersweet moment. It symbolized continuity. Yet the lack of a male heir left her vulnerable in a kingdom where inheritance was fiercely patrilineal. Meanwhile, the brothers Sigebert, Gontram, and Chilperic carved up Sherbert's territories, their rivalry intensifying. Chilperic, always hot-headed and feeling cheated with the smallest and most fragmented share, invaded cities belonging to Sigebert's kingdom, sparking open warfare. Sigebert's alliances, including marriage ties and connections with the Byzantine Empire through the religiously influential Radegund, bolstered his position. Amid these political machinations, the figure of Fredegund emerged with increasing notoriety. Starting as a slave, her ascent to power was steeped in rumor and suspicion, especially after the suspicious death of Queen Galwintha, Brunhild's own sister, allegedly murdered to clear the way for Fredegund's marriage to Chilperic. Fredegund's ruthlessness, cunning, and apparent embrace of dark arts painted her as a formidable adversary in the Frankish power struggles. As epidemics and divine judgments were invoked to explain the chaos, and as bishops wielded spiritual authority against kings, the stage was set for a brutal clash of wills. Brunhild, grappling with loss and exile, was learning the harsh realities of a political arena dominated by men who would not hesitate to destroy any queen who threatened their ambitions. This chapter will explore the complex web of alliances, betrayals, and battles that defined this era, the rise of Brunhild as a political power, the fall of her rivals, and the shifting fortunes of the Merovingian dynasty that would ultimately lead toward the Carolingian transformation of the Frankish world. The death of Sherbert, the eldest Merovingian brother and former king of Paris, left the Frankish realm fractured and vulnerable. His turbulent reign, marked by scandalous marriages and open defiance of the Church, culminated not only in his excommunication but in a succession crisis that would unravel the fragile unity of the Frankish kingdoms. Without a living heir, Sherbert's vast territories and treasure became a prize fiercely contested by his surviving brothers, Sigebert, Gontram, and Chilperic, each eager to expand their dominions. but beyond the squabbling brothers. The fate of those closest to Sherbert, especially Thuddachild, the shepherdess turned queen, exposed the ruthless politics of the time. Though Thuddachild had borne Sherbert's son, the child died at birth, and with Sherbert's subsequent marriage to a nun declared invalid by the church. Thuddachild seized the moment. She gathered Sherbert's hidden gold and jewels, intending to claim her rightful place as widow and guardian of the royal treasury. Yet Gontram, the cunning and calculating younger brother, rebuffed her. With cruel mockery, he imprisoned Thuddachild in a convent and dismissed her claims. This episode was a stark reminder to the Frankish nobility and foreign-born queens like Brunhild of the brutal and often merciless nature of court politics. Queens who dared to assert influence risked exile, imprisonment, or death. Thuddachild's fate, trapped, beaten, and ultimately left to perish, served as a grim warning. Meanwhile, Brunhild herself was adjusting to her new life in Metz, the capital of Austrasia, though a far cry from her native Toledo in Visigothic Spain. Metz was a prosperous city, boasting remnants of Roman civilization, such as an ancient amphitheater, now repurposed for bear baiting, a cruel spectacle that symbolized the cultural tensions of the era. Brunhild found herself a stranger in this court, surrounded by nobles whose Frankish dialect was coarse and whose tastes in poetry and entertainment were unsophisticated compared to the refined Latin literature she cherished. Despite these challenges, Brunhild was no passive figure. Her intelligence, ambition, and strategic mind soon became apparent as she learned to navigate the volatile political landscape. Her pregnancy, which initially brought hope for a male heir, ended with the birth of a daughter. Adding to the uncertainty of her position, male heirs were vital for securing dynastic claims, especially amid the relentless power struggles between Merovingian brothers. Sigebert, the second eldest brother, sought to consolidate his power in Austrasia by cultivating alliances beyond the Frankish borders. He repaired infrastructure, built churches, and forged ties with powerful neighbors like the Byzantine Empire. Through the religious influence of Radegund, his stepmother and a revered nun with connections in Constantinople, Sigebert opened diplomatic channels that would prove crucial in his bid for supremacy. Chilperic, the youngest brother, grew increasingly restless and aggressive. His territory was fragmented and strategically vulnerable, and feeling cheated by the division of lands, he launched invasions against Sigebert's holdings. Igniting open warfare, Chilperic's court was a hotbed of intrigue, with his queen Fredegund rising from humble origins to become a feared and formidable political player. Her role in the suspected assassination of Brunhild's sister Galwanda only intensified the bitter rivalry between these powerful women. The brutal interplay of alliances, betrayals, and bloodshed would define this era. Epidemics ravaged the land, and bishops wielded spiritual authority to discipline kings, while queens fought desperately for survival and influence. Brunhild's story, her rise from foreign princess to a dominant force in Frankish politics, unfolded against this backdrop of chaos and transformation. In the coming chapters, we will delve deeper into the strategies, battles, and personal dramas that shaped the Frankish kingdoms after Sherbert's death, setting the stage for the eventual transformation from Merovingian to Carolingian rule. Following the death of Sherbert, the fragile peace among the Merovingian brothers shattered, plunging the Frankish kingdoms into a fierce contest for supremacy. Sigebert, Gontram, and Chilperic wasted no time in asserting claims to Sherbert's lands, their ambitions fueled by a complex web of personal vendettas, political alliances, and the ever-present shadow of the Church's growing influence. Sigebert, ruling Austrasia from Metz, positioned himself as a ruler in the mold of the late Roman emperors. His court was a center of relative stability and Romanized culture, with efforts to repair infrastructure, rebuild churches, and promote law and order. Sigebert's policies reflected a vision of a united and orderly Frankish realm. But his power was constantly challenged both externally by his brothers and internally by factions within his court. Chilperic, in contrast, was impulsive and aggressive. His lands were strategically important but divided, and he coveted the territories held by Sigebert. Chilperic's military campaigns were marked by bold invasions and harsh reprisals, often driven by personal jealousy and ambition. His court was a cauldron of intrigue, with his queen Fredegund playing a key role in court politics. Fredegund's rise from slave to queen and her ruthless tactics earned her a reputation as a dangerous and cunning figure. The rivalry between the brothers escalated into open warfare, with armies clashing and cities changing hands. Sigebert's alliance with the Byzantine Empire through Radegund's religious connections gave him access to mercenary forces and diplomatic support, bolstering his position. Meanwhile, Chilperic sought alliances with other neighboring kingdoms, including the Visigoths and the Burgundians, to counterbalance Sigebert's influence. Brunhild, now firmly established in Metz as queen consort to Sigebert, began to emerge as a formidable political actor. Her foreign origins and Roman education gave her a unique perspective and skill set. She cultivated relationships with key nobles, bishops, and military leaders, positioning herself as a protector of her son Childebert's future. Brunhild understood that her power depended not just on her marriage but on her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Frankish politics. The personal tragedies of the era, such as the suspicious death of Brunhild's sister Galwintha, likely orchestrated by Fredegund and Chilperic, deepened the enmity between these queens and their factions. Galwintha's murder was more than a family tragedy. It was a political catalyst that intensified the struggle for dominance. Brunhild used this event to rally support and justify military campaigns against Chilperic's territories. Amidst the violence and shifting alliances, the role of the Church grew increasingly significant. Bishops wielded moral authority and acted as kingmakers, but they were also divided along factional lines. Some supported Sigebert's Romanizing vision, while others favored Chilperic's more traditional Frankish approach. The Church's attempts to impose discipline, such as excommunications and calls for reform, added another layer of complexity to the power struggles. The era was also marked by epidemics and social unrest, which weakened kingdoms and disrupted loyalties. These challenges tested the resilience of the Merovingian rulers and shaped the decisions of leaders like Brunhild, who had to balance ruthless pragmatism with strategic alliances. As the wars raged on, Brunhild's influence grew. She became a symbol of strength and survival for Austrasia, determined to secure her son's inheritance and her own legacy. Her political savvy, combined with her ability to command loyalty from nobles and clergy alike, set her apart from many of her contemporaries. This chapter explores the turbulent military campaigns, the rise of court intrigues, and the complex interplay of family loyalties and political ambition. It reveals how Brunhild's emergence as a power player altered the course of Frankish history and paved the way for the eventual decline of the Merovingian dynasty and the rise of new forces that would reshape Europe. The Frankish kingdoms of the late 6th century were a cauldron of shifting loyalties, volatile alliances, and brutal power struggles. Into this turbulent landscape stepped Brunhild, a queen whose political acumen and determination made her one of the most formidable figures of her age. Far from being a mere consort, Brunhild emerged as a central player, navigating the dangerous currents of Merovingian politics with skill and ruthlessness. Brunhild's foreign origins and Roman upbringing gave her a perspective that distinguished her from many of the Frankish nobility. She understood the power of symbolism, ceremony, and alliances, and she wielded these tools expertly. Her marriage to Sigebert was more than a union of two individuals. It was a strategic alliance aimed at securing stability in Austrasia and strengthening ties with the remnants of Roman culture and governance. Yet, her position was never secure. The murder of her sister Galwintha and the ongoing feud with Fredegund and Chilperic loomed large over her court. This personal vendetta intertwined with larger political conflicts, making every decision fraught with danger. Brunhild's response was to consolidate her power through a network of loyal supporters, including bishops, counts, and military leaders who owed their allegiance to her. One of her most significant challenges was managing the fragile alliances that defined the Frankish realms. The brothers' kingdoms, Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy, were often at odds, with shifting boundaries and contested claims. Brunhild's son, Childebert, was a pawn and a prize in this struggle, and securing his inheritance meant both diplomacy and military action. She fostered ties with influential church figures, recognizing that the moral authority of the bishops could legitimize her rule and sway public opinion. Her relationship with Bishop Gregory of Tours, a key chronicler of the era, was complex but crucial. Gregory's writings, though often biased, provide invaluable insight into Brunhild's political maneuvers and the climate of the time. Brunhild also navigated the tension between Roman traditions and Frankish customs. She championed Roman law and governance, which appealed to many nobles who desired order and stability. But this sometimes alienated the more traditional Frankish factions. Balancing these competing interests required diplomatic finesse and sometimes brutal enforcement. Military strategy was another domain where Brunhild left her mark. She coordinated with generals like Duke Boso and Count Go to defend Austrasia and launch campaigns against rivals. Her ability to raise armies and secure resources, including managing her personal treasure, gave her leverage in negotiations and battles alike. Despite these strengths, Brunhild's rule was continuously challenged by internal dissent and external threats. The rivalries with Chilperic and Fredegund intensified, with battles, assassinations, and betrayals punctuating the ongoing conflict. The queen's resilience in the face of these attacks earned her both admiration and enmity. This chapter delves into Brunhild's political strategies, her alliances with the church and nobility, and her role as a military leader. It reveals a woman who transcended the limitations of her time to shape the destiny of the Frankish kingdoms, setting the stage for the eventual transformation of medieval Europe's political landscape. The late 570s and early 580s marked a period of intense warfare and political upheaval across the Frankish kingdoms. The struggle for Austrasia, Brunhild's domain, became a defining battleground in the broader contest for supremacy among the Merovingian rulers. As rival factions vied for control, the fate of the Frankish realms hung in the balance. Chilperic of Neustria, emboldened by his consolidation of power and his alliance with Fredegund, launched aggressive campaigns aimed at breaking Brunhild's hold over Austrasia. His forces ravaged territories, laying siege to key cities and attempting to destabilize her rule. Yet, despite the relentless pressure, Brunhild and her allies refused to yield. The queen's military acumen shone during this turbulent era. Recognizing the importance of both defense and offense, Brunhild coordinated with her generals to protect vital strongholds and execute daring counterattacks. Her alliance with Duke Boso proved especially crucial. His leadership in battle helped repel Chilperic's advances and maintain Austrasian integrity. Meanwhile, the political landscape within Austrasia was fraught with tension. Nobles juggled allegiances, and internal factions sought to exploit the chaos for personal gain. Brunhild's efforts to maintain unity involved shrewd diplomacy and, when necessary, decisive action to quell dissent. She cultivated loyalty through patronage, rewarding supporters with lands, titles, and gifts drawn from her considerable personal wealth. The role of the Church remained pivotal in this conflict. Brunhild's alliance with influential bishops, including Gregory of Tours, lent her reign religious legitimacy and moral authority. The Church's support helped rally the populace and framed her enemies' aggression as a threat not only to her rule but to the divine order itself. Amidst the battles and political machinations, the figure of Brunhild grew in both power and notoriety. Her enemies painted her as ruthless and manipulative, while her supporters viewed her as a bastion of stability and strength in chaotic times. Her personal tragedies, losing husbands, sons, and allies, fueled her determination to secure her family's legacy. The conflict culminated in key battles that tested the resilience of Austrasia's forces. Despite facing formidable opposition, Brunhild's strategic foresight and the loyalty she inspired enabled her to hold her ground. However, the cost was high. Cities were destroyed, populations displaced, and the social fabric strained by years of war. This chapter explores the military campaigns, political intrigue, and personal resilience that defined the war for Austrasia. It paints a vivid picture of a queen navigating the brutal realities of medieval power struggles, whose leadership left an indelible mark on the history of the Frankish kingdoms. The war for dominance in the Frankish realms was as much a battle of shadows and whispers as it was of armies and sieges. Assassinations and betrayals became weapons wielded as effectively as swords and spears. In this deadly game, Brunhild's enemies and allies alike demonstrated ruthless cunning, shifting alliances, and merciless ambition. Chilperic and Fredegund, determined to secure their grip on Neustria and extend their influence, deployed spies and agents provocateurs to undermine Brunhild's faction. Fredegund, in particular, emerged as a formidable political operator, reputed for her cold calculation and willingness to use any means to protect her son's inheritance. Her suspected involvement in the murder of Galwintha, Brunhild's sister, cast a long shadow of infamy over her reputation. Brunhild, far from passive, responded with equal ruthlessness. She orchestrated counter-espionage operations, bribed nobles, and relied heavily on her network of trusted courtiers and clergy. Her ability to navigate the treacherous political currents was a testament to her sharp intellect and indomitable spirit. The assassination of Sigibert, Brunhild's husband, was a turning point. His death plunged Austrasia into turmoil, threatening the fragile alliances Brunhild had carefully forged. The sudden vacuum of power incited chaos, forcing Brunhild into a precarious position as she sought to protect her young son and maintain control. Amidst this chaos, Merivek, Brunhild's second husband, entered the scene as a symbol of rebellion against Chilperic's growing dominance. His dramatic escape from captivity and the subsequent standoff in Tours underscored the volatility of Frankish politics. The confrontation between Merivek, Duke Boso, and Chilperic's forces exposed the fragile loyalties and the ever-present threat of treachery. Boso's duplicity added a layer of complexity to the conflict. His shifting allegiances, influenced by personal ambition and the counsel of soothsayers, made him an unpredictable player. His eventual betrayal of Merivek sealed the latter's fate and underscored the ruthless nature of Frankish power struggles. In the midst of these betrayals, Fredegund's reputation as a witch and sorceress grew among her enemies. Accusations of poisonings and dark magic were not only political smears but reflected contemporary fears and superstitions. These charges were used to justify harsh reprisals against her and her supporters, deepening the divisions within the Frankish elite. Brunhild's resilience was tested repeatedly during this period. Despite the loss of allies and the ever-present danger, she continued to maneuver politically, leveraging her wealth and alliances to maintain her position. Her ability to endure and adapt amid relentless attacks cemented her status as one of the most formidable figures of her time. This chapter delves into the shadowy world of intrigue and betrayal that shaped the fate of the Merovingian kingdoms. It reveals how personal vendettas, political machinations, and brutal power plays intertwined in a deadly dance. With Brunhild standing at its heart, the city of Rouen, with its ancient walls and strategic position on the Seine, became the crucible of Brunhild's defiance. As tensions with Chilperic reached a boiling point, Rouen transformed from a prosperous trading center into a fortress besieged by the relentless ambitions of the Neustrians. Brunhild, now a twice-widowed queen, found herself confined yet unbroken within the city's ramparts. Her marriage to Merovec, though politically fraught and ultimately doomed, had solidified a faction opposed to Chilperic's despotic rule. Together with her loyal supporters, Duke Wolf, and the ever-cunning Bishop Gregory of Tours, she prepared to resist the overwhelming forces arrayed against her. The siege tested the limits of endurance for all within Rouen. Supplies dwindled, morale waned, and outside the walls, Chilperic's armies encircled the city with ruthless efficiency. Yet Brunhild's resolve only hardened. Through secret communications with allies and the strategic dispersal of her treasure, she kept the flames of resistance alive. Within the city, life was a mixture of hope and despair. Nobles debated the merits of surrender versus defiance, while common folk bore the brunt of starvation and fear. Brunhild's leadership became a beacon, inspiring loyalty even as the shadow of defeat loomed. Chilperic, determined to crush this rebellion swiftly, employed brutal tactics. He threatened destruction, promised clemency for surrender, and exploited divisions within the city. But Brunhild's marriage was not merely a personal union, it was a symbol of rebellion. A rallying point for those who refused to bow to tyranny. As winter closed in, the siege dragged on. The political landscape outside shifted rapidly, alliances formed and dissolved. Betrayals unfolded, and the stakes grew ever higher. Brunhild's fate hung in the balance, intertwined with the survival of Austrasia itself. The eventual fall of Rouen marked a turning point. Brunhild was captured, stripped of power, and sent to a convent, a prison cloaked in sanctity. But even in captivity, her influence lingered, her legacy sealed by the defiance she embodied. This chapter explores the human cost of power struggles, the complexities of loyalty, and the indomitable spirit of a queen who refused to yield. It offers a vivid portrayal of siege warfare, political intrigue, and the enduring fight for sovereignty in the turbulent Merovingian era. The fall of Rouen sent shockwaves through the Frankish realms. Brunhild's capture was not just a personal tragedy but a seismic event that reshaped the delicate balance of power. With the queen consigned to a convent and her supporters scattered, Chilperic seemed poised to consolidate his authority over Neustria and beyond. Yet, the political landscape remained volatile, rife with uncertainty and simmering unrest. This chapter delves into the immediate aftermath of the siege, the purges that followed, the shifting allegiances among nobles, and the ever-present threat of rebellion. Chilperic's victory was hollow. He inherited a kingdom fractured by years of internecine warfare, weakened by distrust and factionalism. Brunhild's children became pawns in the ongoing chess game of Frankish politics. Their safety and futures were precarious, safeguarded by allies who balanced loyalty with self-interest. Meanwhile, the Austrasian court mourned the loss of its queen's influence but quietly regrouped, planning to reclaim lost ground. The Church's role in this turbulent era emerges starkly in this chapter. Bishops like Gregory of Tours navigated treacherous waters, balancing spiritual duties with political survival. Sometimes acting as kingmakers, other times as scapegoats. Furthermore, the chapter explores how the war and its outcomes influenced the broader Frankish society, impacting peasants, clergy, and the emerging aristocracy. It highlights how warfare, succession crises, and the intertwining of secular and religious power laid the groundwork for the eventual decline of the Merovingian dynasty. Amidst this backdrop, new figures begin to rise. Ambitious dukes, scheming bishops, and exiled princes each play their part in the unfolding drama that will set the stage for the Carolingian ascendancy. In essence, this chapter paints a portrait of a kingdom at a crossroads, still reeling from civil war, yet bracing for the monumental transformations to come. As the Merovingian kings grappled with internal strife and fractured realms, the stage was set for a profound shift in Frankish power dynamics. The dynasty founded by Clovis, once mighty and unifying, was steadily losing its grip. Fragmentation, weak leadership, and incessant family feuds left the throne vulnerable, eroding royal authority. This chapter explores how the Merovingian kings increasingly became figureheads, their power overshadowed by the rising influence of the mayors of the palace, the chief officials who managed day-to-day governance and military affairs. These officials, initially servants of the king, gradually amassed real political and military power, maneuvering themselves into positions of dominance. Central to this transition is the emergence of the Carolingian family, descendants of the Arnulfings and Pippinids, who skillfully exploited the weaknesses of Merovingian rule. They built alliances, commanded loyal armies, and cultivated ties with the Church, especially the papacy. The Carolingians' increasing control over Austrasia became a key power base from which they would eventually challenge Merovingian kingship. The chapter also delves into the role of the Church in legitimizing new power structures. The alliance between the Carolingians and the papacy culminated in the coronation of Pippin the Short as king in 751, marking the official end of Merovingian political dominance. This shift was not simply a coup but a complex negotiation of power, legitimacy, and religious sanction. Amidst these political machinations, the Frankish kingdom underwent social and administrative transformations. The Carolingians reformed legal codes, consolidated territories, and promoted the Carolingian Renaissance, an intellectual revival that sought to strengthen royal authority through culture and religion. This chapter connects the turbulent era of Brunhild and Chilperic's struggles to the broader narrative of the Merovingians' decline, illustrating how personal ambition, warfare, and strategic alliances paved the way for the rise of one of Europe's most influential dynasties. Through vivid descriptions and detailed analysis, the chapter provides a comprehensive understanding of the forces that ended Merovingian supremacy and ushered in a new epoch under the Carolingians, ultimately shaping medieval European history. The twilight of the Merovingian dynasty was marked not by the triumphant flourish of kings but by a gradual, almost imperceptible surrender of real power. The once formidable Merovingian rulers, descendants of Clovis, had become nominal monarchs, their authority hollowed out by internecine conflict, territorial division, and the unrelenting ambitions of their own nobles. The rise of the Carolingians was a masterclass in political patience, shrewd alliance building, and opportunism. For decades, the mayors of the palace operated behind the scenes, initially as royal stewards managing the king's estates and court. But as the Merovingian kings retreated into obscurity, some historians referring to them as the do-nothing kings, or rois fainéants, the mayors consolidated military and administrative control. The pivotal figure in this transformation was Charles Martel, the hammer who forged the foundations of Carolingian dominance through military prowess and political acumen. His victory at the Battle of Tours in 732 not only halted the Muslim advance into Western Europe but also solidified his reputation as the de facto ruler of the Frankish realms. Charles Martel's consolidation of power was followed by his son, Pippin the Short, who deftly navigated the delicate intersection of royal legitimacy and religious authority. Recognizing the importance of papal endorsement, Pippin sought and received the approval of Pope Zachary to depose the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, effectively transferring kingship to himself. This unprecedented move was not a mere coup but a profound redefinition of royal authority based on divine sanction. The coronation of Pippin in 751 symbolized the dawn of a new era, the Carolingian dynasty's formal ascendancy, which would shape the political and cultural landscape of medieval Europe for centuries to come. It also marked the Church's increasing role as kingmaker, intertwining spiritual authority with temporal power. This transition ushered in significant reforms: the reorganization of the Frankish kingdom, strengthening of central authority, and cultural revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Scholars, clergy, and artists flourished under royal patronage, preserving classical knowledge and creating new intellectual legacies. Yet, this new era was not without its challenges. The Carolingians inherited a realm fractured by decades of war, contested loyalties, and competing regional identities. Their success depended on their ability to enforce unity and foster loyalty amid diversity. In closing, this chapter reflects on the arc from the turbulent reign of Merovingian queens and kings, the intrigues of Brunhild, the ruthless ambitions of Chilperic and Fredegund, to the strategic ascendancy of the Carolingians. The story is one of transformation, from fractured tribal kingdoms to a centralized medieval state underpinned by religious legitimacy and cultural renewal. The legacy of this transition echoes through history, culminating in the reign of Charlemagne, crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800, symbolizing the rebirth of the Western Roman Empire in a new medieval guise. Thus ends the saga of the Merovingians, a dynasty that began with conquest and unity but ended in decline and displacement, making way for the Carolingian dynasty, architects of medieval Europe's future.